Hello there, and welcome back to the second tutorial on Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Practicing skills that are going to enable you to be a better reader and understander of poetry. We're going to start with a recap before we continue on with practicing new questions with which you can interrogate the text. I've set up the poem again as we left off last time, having marked it up in the same way. Remember, we were practicing using different colours to mark up the poem so that you can identify its working parts and elements easily. So, if you'll remember, the pink colour represented the hope or bird element. The green represented the bad or strange weather, and the orange represented the I or the me, the first person in the text. Remember too, as I scroll down, we were looking at a literal question last time. What is the poem saying? Remember, we talked about answering this by using the sentence starter, the poem mentions, and then talking about the words that the poem mentions. Today, as I anticipated at the end of the last tutorial, we're moving on to inferential questioning. Now, an inferential question is about reading between the lines of the poem, between the words, and a question that we can use to guide us in inferential thinking and questioning a poem is what... Whoops-a-daisy. Let me get the pen, not the rubber. Here we are. What does the poem mean? What? Actually, let's not use what. Let's try a different questioning word. How might it be interpreted? Okay. The way I would start answering this question, these inferential questions, is as follows. This poem is about. Okay, so as you can see, these questions are building on each other, and given that we've looked at what the poem mentions, what the poem was saying, now we can actually start thinking about what it's about because we've identified its elements. So let's go back. Let's reread the poem together, and as I read it, I'm going to talk to you about what I think it's about based on the elements that we identified in our literal interrogation of the poem. Okay, so let's reread it. Hope is the thing with feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. I realise I've forgotten to annotate the first, second and third verses to guide us. So I'm just doing that now, and I've reread the first verse. So let's think about what this first verse is saying. Well, what this first verse is doing, for those of you who are familiar with metaphor, and remember a metaphor, I'll just scroll down here and make some notes. I'll do it under, leave myself some space. Actually, let's scroll back up. I'm going to do it on the left-hand side of the poem. So the first verse is using a metaphor to describe hope. Now, a metaphor is something where we say something is like something else, and we generally, a metaphor, we often couple elements that aren't necessarily alike. So hope is quite an abstract concept, and coupling it with feathers and perching and singing a tune without words and never stopping is not exactly a usual way of describing a feeling, giving it a physical object. So Dickinson is using a metaphor here. What is she saying that it's about? She's trying to describe a feeling using a physical object, namely a bird. Now, where Dickinson is clever in this poem, incredibly clever, is that she doesn't actually mention the bird until the second verse, and here I'm going to identify it with an asterisk. So she could have opened the poem with "Hope is a bird," and yet she doesn't. She opens it with "Hope is the thing with feathers," which makes this poem a lot more interesting. So I would say that, to go back to our question, what does the poem mean? How might it be interpreted? I would answer, at least referencing this first verse, is this poem is about hope. And it attempts to describe tangibly means with physical, like a physicality, the feeling of hope. And the way the poet does this is by likening hope to a bird through metaphor. But this isn't the only metaphor that's working in this text. There's a second metaphor. And the second metaphor is the bad weather. Okay? So we have two metaphors working. We have another metaphor. Hopefully you've guessed it. The metaphor is the bad, strange weather. So let's read the second verse now and see if we can't have a sense of what this bad or strange weather might mean or be about. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm, that could abash the little bird, that kept so many warm. Okay, so the question I'd be asking myself here is, what might this bad weather be? What might it represent? When might the bird, hope, be present in this kind of bad weather? So I think the key to understanding this bad weather is actually in the third verse. Let's keep reading. I'll show you. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. The key for me to understanding the bad weather is extremity. So what do you understand the term in extremity to mean? Well, I understand it to mean extreme circumstances. Do you see how the word extreme is contained in the word extremity? So extreme circumstances would probably be difficult ones. Extreme, difficult, hard, challenging. So what we have here is the second metaphor, the bad weather, representing extreme circumstances, difficult circumstances of life. And finally, we need to deal with our third element, the I or the me of the poet. Really, perhaps, we could argue that the I and the me, the poet, the narrator of this poem, is suggesting that they've experienced these situations, these bad, these difficult, these extreme circumstances, these challenges that life throws at us, but they've always felt the presence of this little bird who keeps so many warm. In pink again, I'll draw your attention to that line. Keeps so many warm and never asks anything. So if we go back to our inferential question, what does the poem mean? How might it be interpreted? And use our sentence starter. This poem is about how hope is always is present even in very difficult circumstances, and that it's like a bird constantly singing in our soul and ever present, and singing selflessly because it never asks anything in return nor expects anything. So if you tune into my next video, I'm going to talk about evaluative thinking, which is where you go next as the reader of the text. Thanks for watching.